The night Kate Rourke walked into the Dusty Rose Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, wearing her dead mother's blue dress and a borrowed pair of boots 2 sizes too large. She had no intention of dancing with anyone, least of all a sun-browned cowboy with storm-gray eyes and a crooked smile that looked like it had gotten him into more trouble than it had ever gotten him out of. It was the summer of 1879, and Caldwell was the kind of town that hummed with a dangerous, electric energy, the sort of place where cattle drives ended, and men began spending their wages with the reckless joy of those who had survived something terrible. The Santa Fe Railroad had come through not 2 years prior, and with it came saloons, merchants, lawmen, gamblers, and an unending river of longhorn cattle driven up from Texas along the Kishom Trail. The streets smelled of dust and manure and wood smoke, and at night, when the oil lamps flickered in the windows and fiddle music drifted out into the warm Kansas air, Caldwell transformed itself into something almost beautiful, the way a prairie fire looks beautiful when it is eating up the horizon, and you are just far enough away to forget that it is burning. Kate had been in Caldwell exactly 11 days when she walked into the saloon that Saturday night. She had come from a small homestead outside of Wichita, which she and her younger brother Thomas had been working together since their father had passed 3 winters ago, and their mother had followed him the following spring, as though she simply could not be bothered to remain in a world that no longer contained Patrick Rourke. Thomas had married a good woman named Clara the previous autumn, and the homestead was theirs now in every meaningful sense, though Kate's name was still on the deed. She had felt it then, the gentle but unmistakable pressure of becoming someone who had outgrown the space she was supposed to occupy. Thomas never said a word to make her feel unwelcome. Clara never made a single unkind gesture. But Kate was 23 years old, and she had started waking up in the night with her chest full of something she could not name, something that pressed against her ribs and demanded that she move, that she go, that she find out what the world looked like beyond the flat, golden fields of home. So she had packed what she owned into a single canvas bag, kissed Thomas on the cheek while he tried not to cry, hugged Clara until the baby Clara was carrying kicked between them and made them both laugh, and she had taken the stage south to Caldwell because she had heard there was work there. Respectable work, she had been told, in the form of a position as a seamstress at a dry goods store owned by a widow named Harriet Boone, who was building a modest dressmaking operation on the second floor above her shop. Kate had always been handy with a needle. Her mother had made sure of that, pressing the skills into her fingers the way you press seeds into soil, with the certainty that something would eventually grow from them. Harriet Boone was a compact, sharp-eyed woman of about 50 who smelled like lavender and spoke in clipped, efficient sentences, and she had taken an immediate liking to Kate, which manifested as a steady stream of demanding work and the occasional gruff compliment. The room Kate rented above the shop was small but clean, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and she had placed her mother's small silver hairbrush on the washstand beside the basin, and decided that this was good enough for now. It was good enough. The Saturday night in question began because of Harriet Boone, who had declared after supper that a woman who did nothing but work and sleep was a woman who would be dead of boredom before winter. She had handed Kate the blue dress, which had been left behind by a customer who never returned to claim it, and which had been altered to fit Kate by Kate herself during a quiet Thursday afternoon, and she had said, "The Dusty Rose has a decent fiddle player on Saturday nights and the men are mostly harmless. Go, listen to some music, drink a glass of lemonade if you won't touch the whiskey, and come back before midnight." Kate had not wanted to go. She had stood in front of the small square of mirror in her room and looked at herself in the blue dress, the way the color caught what little remained of her mother in the curve of her jaw and the set of her green eyes, and she had felt simultaneously too young and too old for whatever waited for her in a saloon on a Saturday night in a cattle town. But she had gone because Harriet was right, and because the loneliness had been pressing against her harder than usual that week, and because the music had drifted up through the floorboards all the previous Saturdays and she had lain in her bed listening to it and ached in a way that she could not entirely attribute to overwork. The Dusty Rose was everything she had expected and a few things she had not. It was loud and warm and smelled of sawdust and tobacco and beer, and the fiddle player, a skinny red-headed man named Clem Purdy, was indeed decent, sawing away at a lively reel in the corner while a dozen couples spun across the cleared section of floor near the back. There was a piano against the far wall that a heavy-set man with a mustache was playing with enthusiastic inexpertitude, and together he and Clem created a sound that was more joyful than polished, which suited the crowd just fine. Cowboys in from the trail, still wearing their range clothes though they had made obvious efforts with water and combs, danced with the saloon girls and with the wives and daughters of local merchants who had come out because a Saturday night in Caldwell was one of the few genuine pleasures available, and you took your pleasures where you could find them. A group of men at the bar were engaged in the kind of conversation that was half argument and half laughter, their voices rising and falling with the music. 3 card games were going at the tables near the door. Kate found a spot near the wall, close enough to the dancing to feel the warmth of the moving bodies and watch without feeling conspicuous, and she ordered a lemonade from the bar girl who circulated through the crowd with a tray. She stood and listened to the music and watched the dancers and felt, for the first time in 11 days, something loosen in her chest. This was all right. This was actually all right. She had been there perhaps 40 minutes, had refused 2 invitations to dance, one from a young drover who could not have been more than 19 and smelled powerfully of horse, and one from a red-faced merchant she recognized from the street who wore a wedding ring and seemed to have forgotten about it when she first noticed Monroe Carson. He was not the sort of man you noticed immediately, which was, she would think later, part of what made him interesting. He was not the tallest man in the room, though he was tall enough. He was not the loudest, though she would come to understand that he was capable of considerable volume when the situation called for it. He was not the most decorated or the most dangerous looking, though he had the lean, capable look of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors doing physical work, the kind of economy in his build that comes not from a desire to look a particular way, but from the simple fact of hard necessity. He was sitting at a table near the dance floor with 2 other men, nursing a glass of something amber with the casual patience of a man who was content where he was. He wore a plain dark hat pushed back slightly on his head, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he had the kind of face that took a moment to understand, that you might look at and think ordinary and then look again, and realize was something considerably more than that. His jaw was strong and clean-shaved. His eyes, when the lamplight caught them, were gray, the particular gray of sky in the hour before a storm breaks and the light goes flat and silver over everything. He was watching the dancers, and there was something in his expression that Kate could not immediately categorize. Not loneliness exactly, not longing, though it might have been some relative of longing. It was the look of a man watching something he understood deeply and respected, and was, for reasons known only to him, keeping himself apart from. She looked away. She had not come here to think about strange men at corner tables. But Caldwell was not a large saloon, and the wall she had chosen to stand near was not far from his table, and in the natural flow of the crowd and the heat and the music, she found herself drifting incrementally closer to that corner of the room without ever making a conscious decision to do so. And at some point, he stopped watching the dancers and looked directly at her. The look lasted only a moment. He did not leer. He did not make the appraising up and down survey that some men employed like a weapon. He simply looked at her the way you look at something that has caught your attention and held it, and then, when she met his gaze, he gave a small, unhurried nod, the kind of acknowledgement that carried no presumption and asked for nothing, and returned his attention to his drink. Kate looked away again. Her cheeks were warm, and she was irritated at herself for that. Clem Purdy and his accompanist played for another hour. Kate drank a second lemonade and watched the room and felt herself slowly relax in the way that only good music can produce. The way it gets under your defenses without your quite noticing, until you realize your shoulders have come down from around your ears, and you are moving slightly with the rhythm without having chosen to. She even laughed once, when a cowboy attempted a particularly ambitious spin with his partner, and they both went into a table and sent 3 glasses sliding, and no one was hurt and everyone laughed, and the couple bowed with exaggerated dignity and went right on dancing. She was watching the laugh still playing on her face when Monroe Carson appeared at her elbow. She had not seen him leave his table. He moved quietly for a man his size, with the reflexive, unhurried economy of someone who had learned to navigate through spaces carefully, and he was simply there, standing perhaps 3 feet from her with his glass in his hand, and an expression that was not quite a smile, but was very much in the vicinity of one. "That couple there," he said, not looking at her but toward the dance floor, as though he was simply continuing a conversation that had been ongoing, "have been dancing together every Saturday for 2 months, and have not yet managed to get through a reel without at minimum 1 collision. It is becoming something of an institution." Kate looked at the couple in question, who were indeed dancing again and already looking somewhat precarious. "They seem very happy about it," she said. "They do," he agreed. He finally looked at her then, and up close his eyes were even more distinctly gray, with faint lines at the corners from squinting against sun. "Monroe Carson," he said, and offered his hand. She shook it. His hand was rough and warm and very steady. "Kate Rourke," she said. "You work for Harriet Boone," he said. It was not a question. "I do. How do you know that?" "Caldwell is not as large as it likes to think it is," he said, "and Harriet Boone is a woman who is noticed. Anyone working for her gets noticed too, by association. She speaks highly of you." Kate raised an eyebrow. "You know Harriet Boone well enough to discuss her employees." Something flickered in those gray eyes, faintly amused. "My mother and Harriet were friends before my mother passed. I check on Harriet when I come through town. She mentioned she had taken on a young woman from Wichita who could sew a straight seam in under 10 seconds. She seemed impressed. That is not a thing Harriet gives easily." Kate felt something shift in her assessment of this man, some minor but significant recalibration. "I am sorry about your mother," she said, because she knew exactly what that particular weight felt like, and she would not pretend otherwise. He looked at her, and she could see that he had not expected that, the directness of it, the absence of the polite deflection people usually offered. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It was 2 years ago. She was a good woman." "Mine was a year ago," Kate said. "She was a good woman too." They stood in a moment of shared understanding that required no elaboration. 2 people standing in a loud saloon on a Saturday night in Kansas, held briefly together by the weight of identical losses. Then Clem Purdy launched into a particularly spirited rendition of a Virginia reel, and the room surged back into motion around them. "What brings you to Caldwell?" Monroe asked. "Besides Harriet Boone's unassailable reputation as an employer," Kate laughed, and it surprised her a little, the ease of it. "The need to be somewhere other than where I was," she said, "and the hope that somewhere other than where I was might have some use for what I know how to do." He nodded as though this made perfect sense to him, and she had the impression that it did, that this was a kind of reasoning he understood from the inside. "And does it," he asked, "have use for you?" "So far," she said. "The work is steady. The room is clean. The town is interesting in all the ways a cattle town is interesting. Which is to say, it is occasionally alarming," he said. "Occasionally," she agreed. She looked at him. "And you, what is your business in Caldwell?" "Cattle," he said. "I work a ranch about 12 miles east, a spread called the Double C, owned by a man named Hector Caldwell, no relation to the town's namesake. We run beef up the trail, and I have been helping manage the drives for about 4 years now. The herd we brought up this week got sold to the buyers from Chicago this afternoon, which is the occasion for a Saturday night in town." "Congratulations on a successful drive," she said. He smiled properly then, the full version, and it did what she had known it would do from the moment she first saw it across the room, which was to change his face entirely, open it up from something contained and watchful into something that was simply, disarmingly warm. "Thank you, Kate Rourke," he said. She felt the smile in her own chest and turned her attention back to the dance floor before it could show too plainly on her face. They talked for the better part of an hour, there by the wall with the music swelling around them and the candles burning lower in their holders, and the crowd thinning slightly as families with early mornings began to make their way toward the doors. Monroe Carson was not what she had expected from the brief study she had made of him across the room, which had told her only that he was composed and self-contained and watching the world with more attention than he was receiving from it. Up close, he was all of those things, but he was also funny, in a dry, understated way that required you to be paying attention to catch it. And he was curious in a way that felt genuine rather than polite, asking her about her work and her family and what she thought of Kansas in the summer, and listening to the answers with the focused attention of someone who actually wanted to know. He had grown up in the territory, born in 1851 in a small settlement near Abilene to parents who had come west from Tennessee with 2 horses, 1 mule, and as Monroe described it with a trace of warmth, more optimism than was strictly reasonable for the circumstances. His father had worked the cattle business from the ground up, and Monroe had followed, learning to ride before he could properly remember learning, spending his teenage years on drives and his 20s building a reputation as a man who could be trusted with a herd and with the people managing one. He was 28 years old, and he had been working for Hector Caldwell at the Double C for the past 4 years, and he liked the work and liked the land, and liked the particular freedom of a life that moved with the seasons. He did not talk about himself with the expansive, self-important quality she had encountered in other men who had stories to tell about themselves. He told her things the way you share information with someone you trust to receive it properly, with a certain economy and no performance, and she found this more attractive than she cared to immediately examine. The candles were burning very low. Clem Purdy had slowed his bow hand to a gentle waltz, and the dancers left on the floor were the ones who were not yet ready for the night to be over, swaying in a slower orbit under the guttering lights. Kate noticed that it was getting late, that the crowd had thinned considerably, that the men at the card tables had reached the ruminative late-night stage of their games. She should go back. Harriet had said before midnight, and by the angle of the shadows it was close to that. She said, "I should be getting back." Monroe nodded slowly. He looked at the dance floor, then back at her, and she saw him make some small internal decision. There was something boyish about the moment, for all his composed, steady manner. He was 28 years old and he was nervous, and she found this so unexpectedly endearing that she had to look somewhere else entirely. "They usually play one more after the waltz," he said. "One last song to close out the night. I know you need to go, but I wonder if you might stay for it." She looked back at him. He was watching her with those steady gray eyes and that almost smile, and the candlelight was doing something kind to his face, and Clem Purdy was drawing the waltz toward its close. "I might be persuaded," she said. The waltz ended. Clem Purdy stood and rolled his shoulders and said, loud enough to carry over the room's low murmur, "One more, friends. Last song of the night." Monroe set down his glass and turned to her and extended his hand with a formality that was somehow not stiff at all, that felt instead like something genuine and careful, and he said, "Kate Rourke, would you do me the honor?" She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she put hers in it. He was a good dancer, which she had half expected from the way he moved, with that same unhurried, considered quality he brought to everything, as though he had thought about where each foot needed to go and placed it there with intention. He held her properly, one hand firm at her waist and the other holding hers with a grip that was solid without being possessive, and they moved into the remaining dancers and fell into the rhythm of the music, and it was a country waltz, slow and sweet, the kind of tune that sounds like it has always existed and always will. He was taller than her by several inches, and she was looking at the line of his jaw rather than his eyes when he said quietly, "I owe Harriet Boone a considerable debt of thanks." "For what?" Kate asked. "For hiring you," he said. She looked up at him then. He was smiling, the full, warm version of it, and she could feel the heat of his hand at her waist through the thin fabric of the blue dress, and the music was filling up the whole room, golden and slow and steady, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I do not want this to stop." She did not want the song to stop. She wanted Clem Purdy to keep drawing his bow across those strings indefinitely, to play this one last song of the night until the candles burned entirely out, and the stars faded, and the morning came up over the prairie in its rose and gold splendor. She wanted to stay in this particular moment, this particular square foot of saloon floor with the sawdust under her boots and Monroe Carson's hand warm at her waist, and the music wrapping itself around them like something you could almost hold. The song ended. There was a small, soft silence, the kind that follows good music and precedes the return of the ordinary world. Monroe lowered their joined hands slowly as though in no hurry to conclude this. He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, but in which she could see something open and questioning and very much alive. "I will walk you home," he said, "if you will allow it." She would allow it. The night air outside the dusty rose was warm and thick with the smell of summer in Kansas, the dusty sweetness of it, the distant, low music of crickets in the grass. The main street of Caldwell was quiet at this hour, a few oil lamps still burning in windows, the distant sound of another establishment up the block. But here on this stretch of street, it was just the two of them and the soft sound of their footsteps on the packed earth. They walked slowly, and they talked the way people talk when they do not want to arrive, when the destination signals the end of something they are not prepared to conclude. He told her about the Double C, about the particular country east of Caldwell that he had come to think of as his own in some unspoken, unofficial way, about the way the prairie looked in the morning with the light low and horizontal, and the grass moving in the wind like something breathing. She told him about her mother's garden in Wichita, the roses her mother had managed to coax into bloom despite the fierce Kansas summers, about learning to sew by oil lamp in the evenings, while her father read aloud from whatever book he had found most recently. They arrived at the side door of Harriet Boone's dry goods store, the entrance to the stairs that led to Kate's room, too soon, the way these things always arrive too soon. Monroe took off his hat. It was a gesture of such uncomplicated, genuine courtesy that she felt it somewhere deep. "I would very much like to see you again," he said, "if that is something you would consider." "I would consider it," she said. He smiled, put his hat back on, took a step back. "Sunday morning, there is a decent church service over at the Methodist building on Sycamore Street, if that is of any interest. And after, the Excelsior Hotel does a Sunday dinner that is not entirely contemptible." "That sounds like a plan, Monroe Carson," she said. He nodded, satisfied, unhurried, as though he had known this was how it would go. "Good night, Kate Rourke," he said. She went up the stairs. At the top, she paused and looked back, and he was still standing there in the dark, hat on, looking up at her, and he raised one hand in a small, quiet salute. She went inside. She stood in the dark of her room and pressed her hand to her cheek, which was warm, and the music was still playing inside her. That last song, slow and sweet and steady, the way certain things play on long after they are finished. The Sunday that followed was everything a Sunday in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1879 could reasonably be expected to be, which was warm and dusty, and full of the complicated social choreography of a frontier town attempting to present its most civilized face. Kate wore her second-best dress, a deep green that suited her coloring better than she had realized until Harriet Boone looked at her over the breakfast table and said, with her characteristic economy, "That dress was made for you. Wear it on Sundays." Monroe was waiting outside the Methodist church on Sycamore Street, hat in hand, freshly shaved, wearing a clean white shirt that he had clearly pressed, and he looked, she thought, as though he had put thought into this, which touched her in a way she kept carefully to herself. He had brought 2 of his colleagues from the Double C, a gesture she immediately recognized as considerate, a way of making the morning feel less like an occasion than like a natural thing, less weighted with intention, more simply pleasant. The 2 men were named Rafe Alvarez, a Mexican-American cowhand who had been with the Double C for 6 years, and who had an enormous mustache and a gentleness about him that was immediately apparent, and a younger man named Billy Garrett, who was perhaps 20, red-cheeked and enthusiastic, and who treated Kate with the elaborate, slightly anxious courtesy of a young man who has been told that courtesy is important and is trying very hard to remember all of its components. She liked them both immediately. The church service was conducted by a preacher named Reverend Hobbs, who had strong opinions about temperance and a fine bass voice, and who delivered his sermon with the passionate intensity of a man who believed deeply in what he was saying and wanted very much for you to believe it too. Monroe sat beside Kate in the pew with 2 inches of proprietary space between them, and she was aware of his presence the way you are aware of a fire when you are standing near it, the steady, peripheral warmth of it, the way it occupies some layer of your attention that you cannot entirely direct elsewhere. After the service, in the small dusty yard outside the church, the congregation gathered in the way of frontier communities to catch up and exchange news and conduct the social business of a Saturday stretched into Sunday. Monroe introduced her to people she had not yet met, doing it naturally, without fanfare, in a way that made her feel neither exhibited nor invisible. She noticed that people liked him. He was known, and the knowing of him was straightforward and uncomplicated, the kind of regard that is built through consistency over time. An older woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who seemed to know everyone's business and several things besides, appeared at Monroe's elbow with the stealth of a practiced conversationalist and looked Kate over with the frank, unapologetic appraisal of a woman who had decided long ago that honesty was more efficient than social niceties. "You're the girl working for Harriet," she said. "Not a question." "I am," Kate said. "Where are you from?" "A homestead outside Wichita. My family came from Ohio originally." Mrs. Fenwick nodded. "Monroe, she's well-spoken," she said, as though this was a point in Kate's favor in some ongoing assessment. "She is," Monroe said, with the kind of easy agreement that suggested he found this observation amusing and was not going to say so. The Sunday dinner at the Excelsior Hotel was, as promised, not entirely contemptible, and Rafe Alvarez turned out to be a gifted storyteller who kept the table laughing through most of the meal, with accounts of cattle drives that walked the precise line between plausible and extraordinary. Billy Garrett ate with the concentrated devotion of a young man who was more comfortable with food than with conversation, and occasionally added earnest corroboration to Rafe's more dramatic claims. Monroe sat across from Kate and watched her laugh and talked with her between the broader conversation, and by the end of the meal, she had the feeling that this was a thing she could do indefinitely, that she could sit across a table from Monroe Carson in Sunday light and talk, and listen and laugh, and not tire of it in any timeline she could currently imagine. He rode back to the Double C that afternoon because the ranch required him, and he shook her hand at the door of the Excelsior in the way of a man who would have preferred a different farewell, but was conducting himself correctly given the circumstances, and he said he hoped to be in town the following Saturday. He was. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that Kate came to understand as happiness, which she recognized somewhat belatedly, the way you sometimes recognize that you have been warm only when you notice that you have stopped thinking about the cold. Monroe came into Caldwell most Saturdays, sometimes with Rafe and Billy, sometimes alone, and they would meet at the Dusty Rose or walk the length of the main street or sit on the bench outside the feed store in the long golden light of the summer evening and talk. and the talking between them had the quality of something that had always been ongoing, that was simply continuing from wherever it had last left off. Harriet Boone watched this development with the expression of a woman who has opinions she is tactfully declining to share, which, for Harriet, was itself a significant communication. She occasionally made small adjustments to Kate's schedule that allowed for Saturday evenings without comment, and once, when Monroe came to the shop on a Tuesday afternoon with a small bunch of wild prairie flowers he had picked on the road in, Harriet accepted the flowers on Kate's behalf while Kate was upstairs at her work, put them in a jar of water, carried them up without a word, set them on Kate's workbench, and went back downstairs. Kate had stood looking at the flowers for a long moment, their colors bright against the plain wooden bench, and felt something so full and so tender that it almost hurt. By August, Monroe had met Harriet properly, in the sense of sitting at her table for Sunday supper, which Harriet offered occasionally and infrequently enough that the invitation carried weight. He brought a good bottle of wine that he had obtained from somewhere, and he helped clear the dishes without being asked, and Harriet watched all of this with those sharp eyes and said, at the end of the evening to Kate and no one else, "He's a man who pays attention. That's rarer than it ought to be." In September, Monroe took Kate out to the Double C for the first time. He had a good horse, a bay mare named Sunday, and he had borrowed a second horse for Kate, a solid, calm roan gelding named Pepper, and they rode out of Caldwell in the early morning with a package of food that Harriet had put together without being asked, and which contained, among other things, an entire apple pie wrapped in cloth, which was either a statement of approval or a warning. Kate was not entirely sure which. The ride to the Double C took the better part of 2 hours, and it was one of the most purely beautiful things Kate had ever experienced. The Kansas prairie in early autumn had a quality of light that seemed to belong to some other, more perfect version of the world, amber and clear and infinite, the grass golden and moving, the sky a blue so deep and clean it seemed to have been freshly made that morning. Monroe rode beside her and pointed out things she might have missed, a hawk working a thermal above a distant line of trees, the shallow depression where a creek had run before last summer's drought, the particular shade of the distant hills that told him the temperature was about to drop. She understood, riding beside him through that light, that this land was not incidental to who he was. It was woven into him, the way the Kansas sky was woven into the Kansas summer, inseparable from the thing itself. Hector Caldwell, the owner of the Double C, was a weathered, broad-shouldered man of 60 who had built his operation from nothing and wore the satisfaction of that achievement in the comfortable way of someone who had earned it fair. He greeted Kate with the warmth of a man who was genuinely pleased to see Monroe doing something other than working, and his wife Alina, a dark-eyed woman of Spanish descent who had come to Kansas as a young bride and made the prairie her own through 30 years of formidable will, pressed Kate's hands between her own and looked at her with the concentrated attention of someone conducting a rapid and thorough assessment. "You will stay for lunch," Alina said. This was not a question. The Double C itself was a working ranch in the full sense, with the sounds and smells and constant activity of a place where everything is always either being done or waiting to be done. Kate saw the corrals and the bunkhouse and the long, low main house and the outbuildings, and she watched Monroe move through all of it with the easy competence of someone in his natural element, giving instructions and receiving information, and managing the thousand small concerns of a working cattle operation, and she felt a swell of something she recognized now as pride in him, quiet and warm and entirely her own. They ate lunch on the porch with Hector and Alina, and afterward Monroe took her to a rise to the east of the main buildings where the view opened out across the full breadth of the plain, and the afternoon light was long and golden, and they sat on the grass at the top of the rise and ate cold apple pie from Harriet's cloth-wrapped package, and Monroe looked at the horizon with those steady gray eyes and said, "I have been thinking about buying a piece of land." Kate looked at him. Hector has a section along the North Creek that he is looking to sell. About 300 acres. Good grass, reliable water, close enough to the main operation that I could still work with them, but my own. He paused. I have been saving for it for 3 years. She understood that he was telling her something beyond the bare facts. She understood the shape of what he was not quite saying, and she felt it land in her chest with the weight of something that mattered greatly. "What would you do with it?" she asked, carefully. He looked at her then. "Build something," he said, and then, with a simplicity that was more eloquent than any elaboration would have been, "Start something." The something he did not say remained in the warm autumn air between them, large and tender and not yet ready to be named. She looked at the horizon. "I think that sounds like a good plan, Monroe Carson," she said. He smiled, and she felt it like a change in the weather, like the air before rain. October came in with a cold snap that made the prairie grass crackle underfoot and sent the cattle drifting south in long, slow strings, and the work at the Double C intensified with the end of the season. Monroe was less frequently in Caldwell, and Kate missed him in a way that had become both familiar and persistent, that showed up in the evenings when she was working at her sewing by the lamp, and the window was dark, and the wind had picked up, in a low-grade awareness of absence that was, she understood, simply the cost of having someone whose presence had become important. They exchanged letters on the weeks he could not get into town. This was her first experience of his written voice, and it was, she discovered, exactly the same as his spoken one, unhurried and observant and occasionally dry, full of details about the land and the season and the small events of ranch life. The Mayor Sunday, who had developed an opinion about the new fence posts and was expressing it by refusing to stand near them. The early frost that had done something interesting to the colors of the cottonwood leaves along the creek. The way Rafe had managed to fall entirely into the horse trough, while performing a task that should have involved standing perfectly still. She read these letters in the lamplight and wrote back with equal care, telling him about the commission she had just completed for Mrs. Fenwick's daughter, who was getting married in November, and about the first snow that had dusted the rooftops of Caldwell in a thin, early layer and made the town look, for one morning, like something from a picture book. She told him about Harriet, who had developed a cold she was managing with the grim efficiency she brought to all obstacles, and about the small, quiet pleasures of the work, the satisfaction of a seam that lay perfectly flat, the particular pleasure of matching a fabric to a person and watching the rightness of it come together. She did not tell him, in the letters, the fullest version of what she felt, which was that she was in love with him, that she had arrived at this understanding on a Tuesday evening in mid-October, while she was reading his most recent letter at the window, and had recognized it with the same clarity you recognize your own face in a mirror, without surprise and without question. She did not write this, because it was not yet the right time to say it, and because she trusted the timing, the unhurried, natural pace of what was building between them, the way good things build when you are not trying to rush them. He came into Caldwell on the first Saturday of November, and she knew immediately, when she saw him walking toward Harriet's shop in the cold morning light, that something had shifted. He had the look of a man carrying something, not a burden exactly, but a weight, the kind that comes with a decision that has been made and is waiting to be spoken. Harriet, who possessed an instinct for these things that was almost supernatural, said, "Kate, I think you might take the morning," and disappeared into the back of the shop before Kate could respond. They walked, because the cold morning demanded movement, along the edge of town, where the last of the autumn grass went brown and brittle in the fields, and the wind came down from the north with the first real bite of winter in it, and their breath clouded the air between them. He told her that he had made an arrangement with Hector Caldwell for the section along the North Creek. The paperwork was being drawn up. The land would be his by spring. He told her this, and then he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him gathering something, and she waited with the patience that had become, with him, almost effortless. "I am not a man who is good at saying the large things," he said. "I am better at the small ones, at being where I say I will be and doing what I say I will do and making sure that the people who matter to me know that they are cared for." She looked at him. The wind was pulling at the loose strands of her hair. "But I am going to try to say this properly," he said, "because I think it deserves to be said properly." He stopped walking, and she stopped beside him, and he turned to face her, and his gray eyes were very steady and very direct. "I have not felt about anyone the way I feel about you, not in 28 years of being in the world, and I know that is a serious thing to say, and I mean it seriously." He paused. "I am buying that land because I want to build something on it. A house, a small operation, a life that is worth the building. And when I think about that life, when I picture it, you are in it. Every morning, every evening. You are in the picture, Kate, and without you it is just land." The wind moved the grass at their feet. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that she saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face, the first time she had ever seen him uncertain, and it moved her more than anything else could have. "Monroe Carson," she said, "I have been in love with you since October." The uncertainty left his face like weather clearing. He stepped toward her and took both her hands in both of his, and the warmth of his grip against the cold morning air was something she felt in every part of her, and he looked at her with those gray eyes full of something clear and open and entirely honest, and he said, "Marry me." She said, "Yes." He lifted her hands and kissed them, both of them, and the cold morning light fell across his bent head, and she thought, with the absolute, floor-of-the-ocean certainty of true things, "This is where I was going. All along, this is where I was going." The wedding was set for March, to allow for the land purchase to be completed and for the beginning of construction on a house. This was practical, and Kate was a practical woman, and Monroe was a practical man, and they both understood that love that cannot manage the ordinary business of daily life is love that has not been fully tested yet. The months between the engagement and the wedding were not empty, however. They were full of the beautiful, complicated work of two people learning how to build a shared life while still standing in their separate ones, of long letters and cold Saturday mornings in Caldwell, and one memorable Sunday, when Monroe arrived at the Double C, with the first rough timbers being laid for the foundation of the house on the North Creek property, and he walked Kate through the space of it, the rooms that were as yet nothing but intention and geometry and the smell of new wood, and said, "This will be the kitchen. I thought the window should face east, so you get the morning light." And she understood that he had been paying attention, that he had heard her mention the east window in her room at Harriet's and the morning light, and had filed it away and given it back to her in the most concrete form possible. And she had stood in the middle of what would be her kitchen with the winter sky above, and her heart so full she could not speak. She went home to Wichita for Christmas to see Thomas and Clara, who were by now enormously pregnant, and whose happiness in the small homestead was so complete and uncomplicated that it was like standing in sunlight. Thomas wept when she told him about Monroe, honest, unconstrained tears of relief and happiness, and Clara hugged her and said that she had known from the moment Kate came through the door that something good had happened, because Kate had walked differently, which Kate found mildly alarming as an observation, but filed away as evidence that happiness has a physical signature. She came back to Caldwell in the first week of January, and Monroe met the stage, which he had not done before, and the sight of him standing there in the cold with his hat on and his breath misting the air and his face going from careful stillness to the full warm smile, the moment he spotted her through the stage window, was one of those images she would carry with her always, the way certain things lodge in the memory with perfect clarity and stay there. He kissed her for the first time that evening properly on the porch of Harriet Boone's shop, in the blue-black cold of a Kansas January night, and it was unhurried and tender and very sure, and she kissed him back and felt the music start again, that last slow waltz, the way it had played in her chest since that first night at the Dusty Rose, and she understood that it had been playing there all along. That first song was also this one, was also every one that would come after. Harriet, whose window faced the street, said nothing the next morning, but there was a plate of fresh biscuits on the breakfast table that had not been there before, which Kate interpreted correctly. February brought one final complication, because life is not a story that arrives without them, and the complication arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Parsons. Gerald Parsons was a land speculator from Topeka who had come to Caldwell with money and an inclination to acquire things, and one of the things he had decided he wanted to acquire was the section of land along the Double C's North Creek, the same land that Monroe had arranged to purchase from Hector Caldwell, and for which the paperwork was nearly finalized. The details of it were both familiar and infuriating. Parsons was the kind of man who understood very well how to use money as a lever, and he had approached Hector Caldwell with an offer considerably above the agreed-upon price. And Hector, who was a man of his word, but who was also a man with debts from a difficult season, found himself in an uncomfortable position. He came to Monroe directly and told him honestly, which was consistent with his character, and Monroe had listened to the whole thing with his face very still and his eyes very quiet, which Kate had come to recognize as his manner when something had genuinely disturbed him. Kate heard all of this from Monroe himself, on a cold February Saturday, sitting at the table in the back room of Harriet's shop, with cups of coffee that they kept refilling, because the afternoon was cold, and the conversation required warmth to get through. He told her without dramatizing it, laying out the facts with his characteristic plainness, and she could see underneath the plainness the thing he was not dramatizing, which was the real cost of it, the 3 years of savings and the careful planning and the house timbers already laid and the east-facing kitchen window. She asked him what he was going to do. He said he intended to go and speak with Gerald Parsons directly, which she thought was very much like him. What followed was a week of considerable tension, conducted at long distance, that Kate spent in a state of controlled anxiety that she managed by sewing with tremendous precision and being very good company for Harriet, who was not fooled for a moment. The situation resolved itself through a combination of Monroe's directness and Hector Caldwell's fundamental decency, which had not, it turned out, entirely succumbed to the weight of the financial pressure. Monroe met with Parsons and laid out, with calm and without embellishment, that an agreement had been made and that he intended to honor his end of it and expected the same of the other parties involved. Parsons was a speculator, not a villain, and found in Monroe's composed certainty something that gave him pause. Hector, faced with the parallel conversation with Parsons and with his own conscience, made a decision that cost him money in the short term and earned him something more lasting, and the sale to Monroe went ahead as arranged. Monroe wrote Kate a letter when it was settled that said, in its entirety, "The land is mine. The house will be ready by the end of March. I plan to be the best neighbor Gerald Parsons has ever had, which should be straightforward, as he does not appear to have any." She read this and laughed until she had to sit down. The wedding of Kate Rourke and Monroe Carson took place on the 22nd of March, 1880, at the Methodist Church on Sycamore Street in Caldwell, Kansas, on a day that could not have been better arranged if the weather had been sent a formal invitation and instructed to cooperate. The sky was clear and deep blue, and the air had the particular, fragile warmth of early spring, cold enough to need a good coat in the morning, but softening through the afternoon into something almost gentle, the kind of day the prairie offers occasionally in March as a promise of what is coming. Thomas and Clara came from Wichita, Clara with the baby, a boy born in January whom they had named Patrick after their father, and he slept through the ceremony in Clara's arms with the serene indifference of someone who had very recently arrived and had not yet developed strong opinions about weddings. Thomas gave Kate away with his hand on hers shaking slightly, and when the preacher, Reverend Hobbs in his finest gravity, asked who gave this woman, Thomas said, "Her family does, with more love than I can adequately express," and there was not a dry eye in the vicinity of the Rourke row. Rafe Alvarez was Monroe's best man, a role he conducted with enormous dignity, interrupted by a single, involuntary moment of emotion during the vows that he covered immediately by examining the ceiling with considerable interest. Billy Garrett sat in the front row and forgot, apparently, that he was a grown man, and simply beamed throughout the ceremony with the unconstrained happiness of someone attending their favorite event. Harriet Boone sat in the third row in her best dress, a deep burgundy that suited her admirably, and she watched the proceedings with her characteristic precision and did not weep, but her expression was the expression of a woman who is profoundly, carefully moved and is handling it in her own way. Kate wore a dress she had made herself, because of course she had, of ivory silk that had come by dry goods order from St. Louis, with small pearl buttons at the cuffs and a neckline that was proper and elegant in equal measure. She had spent 3 months on it in every spare hour she could find, and it was the finest thing she had ever made. And she knew it was fine not only because of the work, but because she had made it for this specific purpose, for this specific morning. And things made with that quality of intention carry it in their fabric. She walked down the aisle and saw Monroe at the end of it, standing straight and still in a dark suit that he had ordered from the tailor on Cedar Street, and which fit him perfectly, his hat in his hands, his gray eyes watching her come toward him with an expression so open and so full and so entirely unguarded that she felt her throat tighten and her eyes sting, and had to breathe very deliberately through the last 10 steps. When she reached him, he said, very quietly just for her, "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." She looked at him and said, just as quietly, "Don't make me cry in church, Monroe Carson." He smiled, the full warm smile, and took her hand, and they turned together toward Reverend Hobbs. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, the words that had been spoken in churches and fields and river banks for generations, but in the speaking of them Kate felt them as entirely new, as if they had been written specifically for this moment, for this man, for this particular morning in March. She said "I will" and meant it with every part of herself, the way you mean the true things from the floor up. The celebration after was held in the yard beside the church, which the women of the Methodist congregation had decorated with early spring flowers, and which contained a long table of food that represented, collectively, the culinary ambitions of approximately 15 households. Clem Purdy and his piano-playing companion had been engaged to provide music, and they set up in the corner of the yard and played with the cheerful enthusiasm of men who had been hired for a joyful occasion and intended to live up to the commission. Monroe danced with Kate in the March sunshine to the second song Clem played, which was a waltz, because of course it was, and they danced with their faces close together and her hand in his and his hand at her waist, and she could feel him smiling even when she was not looking at his face, could feel it in the way he held her, warm and certain and very glad. Rafe danced with every woman present, including Harriet Boone, who allowed this with the expression of a woman making a significant exception, and who danced with remarkable grace. Billy Garrett danced with Clara, very carefully, because of the baby, while Thomas watched with the expression of a man who trusted that everything was under control while simultaneously being prepared to intervene. They ate and drank and talked and laughed for the better part of the afternoon, and the light moved across the yard in the long, slow way of spring, and the music kept going, and Kate looked across the yard at one point and found Monroe looking back at her from across the crowd, and they held that look for a moment, just the two of them, over the heads and conversations of everyone they loved, and it was one of those wordless exchanges that says everything necessary. When Clem finally packed up his fiddle in the early evening, and the last guests began to make their way toward home, and the yard had the quiet, warm embers quality of a celebration that has been entirely successful, Monroe found Kate beside the food table where she was helping to collect dishes, and he took the dish she was holding out of her hands and gave it to the woman who was passing with a stack of them, and took Kate's newly empty hands in his and said, "Mrs. Carson." She felt it move through her, that name. She had known it was coming, had been expecting it, and it still moved through her like the first note of a song she already loved. "Mr. Carson," she said. He brought her hands up and held them against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat, steady and sure as everything else about him, and looked at her with those gray eyes that the spring evening light had turned almost silver, and said, "Let's go home." The house on the North Creek property was finished by mid-March, and it was everything the laid-out timbers in the cold had promised, and several things they had not. Monroe had built it with care, with the help of Rafe and Billy and 2 other ranch hands, and he had thought about every part of it with the same attention he brought to everything he considered important. It was not large, but it was well made, with a solid foundation and a roof that would hold in a Kansas winter, and a porch that faced west to catch the afternoon light, and a kitchen with windows facing east, exactly as promised, through which the morning sun came in long and bright and golden, and landed across the plain wooden floor in a way that Kate, on the first morning she woke in the house that was hers, stood in and simply breathed. Spring passed into summer, and summer had the quality of those first years that are good from the beginning, full of work and learning, and the ongoing, intricate project of building a shared life. Monroe worked the Double C and his own North Creek acres, beginning with cattle on a modest scale, and Kate set up a small sewing operation that she ran from the house, taking commissions from Caldwell and the surrounding homesteads, with Harriet Boone's blessing and occasional referrals. The days had a rhythm that suited them both, a balance of work and quiet, and the particular, sustainable pleasure of being in the right place with the right person. In the evenings, Monroe would come in from the land and she would hear him at the well and then his boots on the porch steps, and that sound, that specific sequence, became one of the most comforting things she had ever known, the reliable, daily confirmation that he was home and she was not alone, and the world was exactly as it should be. They had their disagreements, because people who are paying attention always do. Monroe could be infuriatingly patient in situations where Kate wanted resolution now, and Kate could be what Monroe described, with diplomatic care, as remarkably determined once you have made a decision, which she acknowledged was accurate while maintaining that it was also a virtue. They were different enough in their rhythms and instincts to produce occasional friction, and similar enough in their fundamental values to resolve it without lasting damage. The great accommodation of that first year was the land itself. Kate had grown up on a homestead and was not unfamiliar with the demands of ranch life, but the North Creek property made demands that were specific and ongoing, and she was learning its particular language. The way the creek ran in spring and thinned in summer, the particular behavior of the grass in different weathers, the sounds the cattle made at night that meant nothing and the sounds that meant something needed attention. Monroe taught her these things without condescension, with the same even patience he brought to teaching anything, and she learned them with the speed of someone who is genuinely interested in the subject. By autumn of that first married year, she was pregnant. She told Monroe on a September evening on the porch, with the last of the summer's warmth in the air and the creek running low and clear below the rise, and he went very still for a moment in the way of a man receiving information that is reorganizing everything inside him, and then he turned to her, and his face was doing something she had not seen before, something entirely open and almost young, and he said, "Kate," and could not seem to immediately follow it with anything else. She waited. He said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" She said yes, she was well, she was very well. He took both her hands and held them and looked at her with those gray eyes full of something that was part joy and part something deeper and older than joy, and said, "I am going to be the best father I know how to be." She believed him absolutely. The winter was cold, as Kansas winters are, and the North Creek froze in places, and the cattle needed managing, and Monroe put in long days in the cold and came home in the evenings, and was very attentive in the way of a man who is perpetually a little worried, and is managing it through action rather than expression. He was not overbearing about it, which she appreciated deeply, but he was careful, and she allowed herself to be cared for with the grace of someone who understands that care received gracefully is also a kind of giving. Harriet Boone came out to visit in November, a journey she undertook in Monroe's wagon that he drove himself to fetch her, a gesture that cemented his standing with her permanently, and she spent a Sunday afternoon in the house on the North Creek, and examined every seam of every curtain Kate had made and found them all satisfactory, which was Harriet's version of high praise. Rafe Alvarez appeared at the door on a Saturday morning in December with a carved wooden cradle that he had made himself over the preceding months, every joint fitted with the care of a man who takes woodworking very seriously, and he set it on the kitchen floor and stood back and looked at it with the bashful pride of someone who has made something they are genuinely pleased with. Kate hugged him until he turned red, and Monroe shook his hand for a long time. The baby came in April, 1 year and 1 month after the wedding, in the house on the North Creek with the east windows full of spring light, delivered by the midwife from Caldwell, a steady-handed woman named Mrs. Garvey, with Monroe in the next room conducting the most productive renovation of the back porch doorframe in the property's history, which was his method of managing an anxiety he would not inflict on Kate by expressing. He was a boy. Kate held him first, because she had done the relevant work, and looked at his face, which was still entirely new to the world, with the wonder that apparently attends this moment regardless of how much you have been told about it. Then Monroe came in from the porch, where Mrs. Garvey had fetched him, and he stood at the edge of the bed with a look on his face that Kate would remember for the rest of her life, that particular expression of a man who is encountering something so significant that all of his usual composure has simply dissolved. And he said, "Hello," to the baby, very quietly, as though they were meeting and he wanted to make a good impression. They named him Patrick Daniel Carson, Patrick for Kate's father and Daniel for Monroe's, and he was, from the beginning, a person with strong opinions and considerable volume, which Rafe Alvarez said was inevitable given his parentage, and which Billy Garrett found endlessly delightful. The years on the North Creek property moved with the quality of things that are genuinely good, not perfect, because nothing is, but possessed of a deep, underlying rightness that made the difficult parts manageable and the good parts luminous. Monroe's cattle operation grew steadily, carefully, the way he did everything, and by the middle of the decade he had expanded the acreage by purchasing an additional parcel from a homesteader who had decided the plains were not for him, and he had 2 more ranch hands working the property through the busy seasons. Patrick grew from a baby with strong opinions into a small boy with even stronger ones, and an apparently infinite capacity for getting into everything that could potentially get him into trouble. By the time he was 3, he had a love for Monroe's horses that was reciprocated with what appeared to be genuine equine affection, and he spent considerable portions of his days in the corral being patiently supervised by Rafe Alvarez, who had appointed himself the boy's unofficial godfather in the practical sense of someone who shows up reliably and teaches you things. Kate's sewing work had grown as well, and she had taken on a small apprentice, a 15-year-old girl from a nearby homestead named May, who had the quick hands and natural eye of someone who would go far if given proper instruction. Kate taught her the way her mother had taught her, with patience and the belief that skill honestly transmitted is one of the genuine gifts one person can give another. In 1884, a drought came to that part of Kansas, as droughts did, as they always eventually did, moving across the plains with the unarguing authority of weather, and it took a serious toll on the grass and the creek and the cattle, and there was a year of genuine hardship that required everything Monroe had built in terms of both material preparation and inner resilience. He managed the herd down to a size the land could sustain, made the decisions that needed making with the steadiness she had always found in him, and held the operation together through the worst of it without the kind of internal damage that breaks a person's spirit along with their circumstances. They were not untouched by it. There were nights when Kate sat at the kitchen table with the accounts, and the numbers were not what they needed to be, and Monroe sat across from her with coffee and they worked through it together, because that was how they did everything together, without pretending that it was other than it was, and the east window was dark above the table, but the lamp was warm between them. The drought broke in late 1885, and the creek came back and the grass came back, and the herd was rebuilt with the same methodical care that had built it the first time. And there was the particular, earned satisfaction of those who have come through something hard and found themselves still standing and still themselves. Kate discovered she was pregnant again in the spring of 1886, 6 years after Patrick, which surprised everyone including Kate and Monroe, who had arrived at a kind of settled peace with Patrick being the full sum of their family, and found themselves now recalibrating with something between astonishment and joy. This baby was also a boy, which Patrick, who was 5, received with the complex response of someone who had anticipated having a sibling in an abstract sense, and was now confronting the specific reality of sharing his parents with an actual small person who cried at unreasonable hours. He adjusted, because children of good-willed parents generally do, and by the time the baby was 3 months old, Patrick had appointed himself the authority on his brother's schedule and preferences, which he communicated to Monroe and Kate with extensive and sometimes inaccurate confidence. They named the second boy James, for Monroe's older brother who had died of fever in his 20s and whom Monroe missed in the quiet, persistent way of those who lose people they genuinely admired. James proved to be, in temperament, the precise opposite of Patrick in almost every way that temperament admits of difference, which the family agreed was either a cosmic joke or the universe's method of ensuring balance. Where Patrick was loud and certain and in motion, James was quiet and watchful and still, with enormous dark eyes that he appeared to be using to conduct a thorough examination of everything he encountered before committing to an opinion about it. Monroe looked at James when he was about 4 months old and said, with the conviction of a man recognizing something familiar, "He thinks before he acts. He is going to be the sensible one." "He is a baby," Kate said. "He is a sensible baby," Monroe said. He was, as it turned out, correct. The years of the late 1880s were, broadly, years of prosperity and steadiness on the North Creek property, the kind of years that look modest from the outside and feel, from the inside, like everything you actually wanted. The cattle operation ran well. The sewing work brought in enough supplementary income to make the comfortable cushion between sufficient and more than sufficient. The house, which Monroe continued to maintain and improve with the same attention he had brought to building it, had become fully itself, layered with the specific character of people who had lived in it with care, and with the accumulation of ordinary mornings and particular evenings, and all the moments in between that do not make for dramatic stories, but constitute, in their totality, an actual life. Patrick grew into a boy who was going to be a cattleman, and who knew it already at 7, following Monroe around the property, with the focused dedication of someone undergoing a training program of his own design. James grew into a child who was, as Monroe had predicted, markedly sensible, and who by the age of 2 had developed a method of communicating his precise requirements that involved a minimum of fuss and a maximum of efficiency, which he had apparently derived independently, and which Monroe found philosophically congenial. In the evenings when the boys were in bed and the house was quiet, Kate and Monroe sat on the porch or at the kitchen table or, in winter, close to the stove, and they talked, the way they had always talked, from that first night at the wall of the Dusty Rose through all the years between, with the same quality of genuine, unhurried attention that had been the foundation of everything. She was still making him laugh, and he was still making her think. She was still occasionally more certain than the facts quite warranted, and he was still patient enough to let events prove her right without saying so. He still moved through the world with that composed, attentive quality, and she still found it, after all these years, not just admirable but beautiful, the specific beauty of a person who is completely themselves. One Saturday evening in October of 1888, 9 years after the night they had first spoken at the wall of the Dusty Rose, Monroe came in from the north pasture and washed up and stood in the kitchen doorway with the last of the sunset behind him through the window, and Kate was at the stove, and he said, "Clem Purdy is playing at the Dusty Rose tonight." She looked at him. "Rafe is taking Billy's sister," he said, "and Billy is going because he always goes anywhere Rafe goes." "I thought we might go as well." Kate considered this. The boys were old enough now that Mrs. Garvey's niece, a dependable young woman named Annie who had looked after them before, could be trusted with them for an evening. "I think we might," she said. The Dusty Rose was much the same as it had always been, which was, Kate thought, part of its considerable charm. Caldwell had changed in 9 years, grown larger and more settled, the wildest edges of its cattle town character softening as the drives became less frequent, and the railroad trade became more the foundation of its economy, and there were more families on the main streets now and more permanents in the establishments. But the Dusty Rose had the tenacious character of the things that endure, the same sawdust on the floor and oil lamps in the brackets, and the same general atmosphere of people who have worked hard all week, and have decided that Saturday night is worth celebrating. Clem Purdy was older, they all were, but he had lost nothing in the intervening years, and he stood in his corner and played with the same enthusiastic precision Kate remembered from the first night, and the music filled the room in the way that good music fills whatever space it is given, generously and completely. They danced. They had danced many times since that first waltz, but there was something about being back in this particular room with this particular music that returned everything to that original clarity, the warmth and the candlelight and the sawdust underfoot and Monroe's hand at her waist, and the music wrapping itself around them. Rafe danced with Billy's sister, a young woman named Sarah who was clearly extremely pleased about this, and Billy stood at the bar with the contentment of a man whose preferred form of entertainment is watching other people be happy. Kate danced with Monroe and felt, as she always felt in his arms, completely at home. They moved through the later songs as the evening deepened, through the faster reels and the slower waltzes, until the crowd had thinned to the ones who were not ready to let it go, and Clem was drawing his bow toward the last few songs of the night. Monroe pulled her a little closer in the way he had, that subtle shift that was both practical and entirely personal, and said near her ear, "Do you remember?" She knew exactly what he was asking. "I remember," she said. "I wish the music had never stopped." "Did you?" he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "You knew," she said. "You could see it." "I hoped," he said. "There is a difference." The last song of the night was a waltz, as it had been that first night, and they danced it to the end, and when Clem drew the final note and lowered his bow, there was that same small silence, that same soft suspension of the ordinary world before it came back in. Monroe held her for a moment longer than the music required. Then he looked at her in the lamplight that was lower now and golden, and he said, "Shall we go home, Mrs. Carson? Home." The North Creek property with the east windows and the porch and the 2 boys asleep in their beds, and Sunday the mare in the corral and the smell of good Kansas earth and the sound of the creek in the dark. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." Outside, the October night was cool and clear, the sky enormous and thick with stars in the way that only a prairie sky can be, without walls or trees or city light to diminish it. Monroe's horse and Kate stood patiently at the post, and he helped her up with the same care he had always brought to this, and they rode out of Caldwell in the star-thick dark, side by side, the horses walking with the comfortable rhythm of familiar ground. Halfway home, with the town lights behind them and the prairie opening up in all directions and the stars in their full, uncrowded glory overhead, Monroe reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. She gave it to him. They rode the rest of the way like that, hand in the dark, with the horses following the road they knew and the stars moving overhead in their slow, ancient arc, and the night air carrying the smell of October grass and the distant sweetness of the creek. When they reached the property, the house was dark and quiet, Annie having long since settled the boys, and they put the horses up and Monroe checked the latch on the corral gate and Kate stood in the yard and looked up at the sky and breathed the night air and felt the fullness of everything, the whole completed shape of the life they had built here. The love that had started in a saloon on a Saturday night with one last song and had grown into this house and these children and this man and this land and this long, quiet, beautiful life. Monroe came and stood beside her. He looked up at the same sky. 9 years, he said. 9 years, she agreed. He turned and looked at her in the starlight, and his face was clear and open and entirely familiar. The face she had been learning since she was 23 years old and had not yet finished learning at 32, the face she expected to still be learning at 60 and beyond. I would do it again, he said. Every day, every single one. She looked at him. The stars were very large and very bright and the prairie was absolutely quiet. So would I, she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood there a moment longer in the October dark with the stars overhead and the house behind them warm and full. And then they went inside, because they were home, and because home was where everything was, and because nothing of any importance remained unfinished or undone. Patrick grew into a young man who did indeed become a cattleman, working the North Creek property alongside Monroe from the time he was 14 with a seriousness of purpose, and a skill for the work that Monroe regarded with unconcealed pride and occasional bemusement, because Patrick had also developed opinions about how the operation should be run that were, while not always correct, never without a thoughtful basis. And the conversations between father and son about these matters were among the finest entertainment the North Creek property produced in those years. James grew into a young man who, as predicted, was the sensible one, and who developed, somewhat unexpectedly, a gift for mathematics and a passion for reading that led him, eventually, to pursue further education in Topeka, a development that Monroe supported without hesitation and with considerable financial ingenuity. Because the idea that his son wanted to learn everything he could about the world was a thing Monroe found entirely admirable and wholly in line with what he had always hoped for his children, which was that they would become fully themselves. Harriet Boone retired her shop in 1891 and came to live on the North Creek property, in the extra room that Monroe had added to the east side of the house, in a construction project he undertook the spring of that year with the same careful thoroughness he brought to all physical work. She claimed this arrangement was temporary and practical, and Kate agreed with her on both points without saying what they both understood, which was that Harriet was 72 and had no one but them, and that this was not a temporary arrangement in any meaningful sense. She lived there for 8 years, in the east room with the window she preferred, and in those 8 years she remained precisely herself, sharp and certain and occasionally difficult and fundamentally, unswervingly good, and the boys regarded her with a combination of awe and affection that she accepted with what appeared to be satisfaction, and she and Monroe developed, over those years, the particular comfortable relationship of two people who respect each other enormously and have agreed, without discussing it, never to say so directly. She died in 1899, in the spring, in her own bed in her own room, at 80, which Kate said was an achievement in keeping with Harriet's character. And Monroe spent a quiet afternoon after the funeral leaning on the corral fence and looking at nothing in particular. And Kate came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that for a while. Because some things require only presence and not words. Rafe Alvarez stayed at the Double C until Hector Caldwell's son inherited the operation and brought his own foreman, at which point Rafe, who was by then in his late 50s and had some savings and a great deal of skill, came to work for Monroe on the North Creek property, where he had always been more at home anyway, and he spent his evenings on the bunkhouse porch carving increasingly elaborate wooden things for whoever in the family needed something carved, and he was happy there. Genuinely and simply happy, in the way that some people manage to be when they have found the place and the people that suit them. Billy Garrett married Sarah, his own sister, in 1887, and they settled in Caldwell, and Billy became a reliable fixture of its commercial life. And the friendship between the two families was one of those comfortable, long-standing things that requires no maintenance because it is built from something solid enough to sustain the weather of years. The Dusty Rose continued to provide music on Saturday nights for many years, though Clem Purdy eventually retired his fiddle and handed the Saturday evening obligation to his nephew, who was not quite as good but was getting there. Monroe and Kate went back, occasionally over the years, for special evenings for anniversaries, and once, when Patrick was courting a girl from a homestead south of town and was paralyzed by the specific terror of asking her to dance, Monroe took Kate to the Dusty Rose on a Saturday night and danced with her in their particular way, easy and warm and entirely certain, and Patrick watched and found in the watching some piece of courage he needed, and he asked the girl to dance, and she said yes. Her name was Lucy, and she was a clear-eyed, sensible young woman who loved Patrick with the fond, slightly exasperated affection of someone who understands very well who they have chosen. And the wedding on the Double C property in 1898 was everything a wedding in the full flower of spring Kansas should be. The century turned, and the world turned with it, and the West that had been wild in the years of Kate and Monroe's meeting was becoming something else, more settled and more certain, the open range shrinking as homesteads multiplied and fences went up, and the great cattle drives of the Kishom Trail era became stories rather than ongoing events. Caldwell itself was a different town than the one Kate had arrived in as a 23-year-old woman with a canvas bag and borrowed boots, a steadier and quieter place, and the Dusty Rose had competition from newer establishments and a decreasing number of trail dust cowboys requiring a Saturday night after a long drive. But the North Creek property was as it had always been in the ways that mattered, the grass and the water and the good flat Kansas sky, and the house with the east windows and the porch that faced west. Monroe was 51 in 1902, and the gray at his temples had spread, but the gray eyes had not changed at all, and he moved through the land he had bought with 3 years of savings, and had built into something real with the same quiet, purposeful attention he had always brought to the things he cared about most. Kate was 46, and she was the same person she had always been in the core of herself, more settled in her certainties, more patient with uncertainty, still determined once she had made a decision, still capable of being moved by small things, a particular quality of morning light, the smell of fresh bread, the specific sound of Monroe's boots on the porch steps in the evening, which had not lost its power in 22 years of being the most reliable sound she knew. They had a grandchild by then, Patrick and Lucy's firstborn, a girl named Elise who was 3 years old and who had Patrick's strong opinions and Lucy's practical disposition, and who was, in the estimate of her grandparents, the most interesting person of her age that had ever existed, which was not an objective assessment but was a sincere one. On a Saturday evening in October of 1902, Monroe came in from the land earlier than usual, which was not his habit but which meant the day's work was done, and the season was winding toward the end of what needed doing before winter. He washed up and changed his shirt and came to the kitchen where Kate was at the stove, and he said, "Harriet's nephew is playing at the Dusty Rose tonight." Kate turned from the stove. She looked at him. He was 51 years old, and she knew his face better than she knew any other face in the world. Every line and shift of expression, the particular set of his jaw when he had made a decision, and the particular quality of his stillness when he was waiting for something he wanted. "Is he any good?" she asked. "According to Rafe, he is getting better," Monroe said. She thought about this. She took the pot off the stove and covered it and untied her apron and said, "Then let us go hear him improve." They rode into Caldwell in the October evening, which had the crisp, clean quality of autumn at its finest, the air cold enough to be bracingly alive, and the sky still holding the last of the sunset in a long, faded band of rose and gold above the western horizon. The town was quieter than it had been in the old days of the cattle drives, but it had its own steady life, its own Saturday evening pleasure, and the Dusty Rose was warm and lit, and the sound of music reached them before they were through the door. They danced. They danced to the first song and the second and the slow ones in between, and the other people in the room moved around them, and the lamplight was golden, and the music was good, getting better. And Monroe held her the way he had always held her, with that firm, careful hand at her waist and her hand in his, and they moved together in the way of people who know each other completely and are still, after all the years of knowing, glad of it. When Clem Purdy's nephew announced the last song of the night, his voice carrying over the room with the particular significance of that phrase, Monroe pulled her a little closer, and they moved into the final waltz together, slow and certain, and the music was everything that music had ever been to them, the language of everything they had not yet known how to say on the night they first danced, and everything they knew now. Kate closed her eyes for a moment and listened, felt the music and felt Monroe's hand and felt the warmth and the lamplight and the night outside and the prairie beyond, and the life, the whole long beautiful life, and she wished, as she had wished on the very first night, that the music would never stop. But she understood now what she had not understood then, which was that it never really had. That it had been playing this whole time, through every morning and every evening and every difficult winter and every beautiful spring, through children and grief and work and plenty and drought and recovery, and all the 1,000 ordinary extraordinary days of 22 years, it had been playing that first waltz, steady and warm and unhurried, the way the best things go on. The song ended. Monroe held her for a moment in the silence, and then he leaned his head down and said very quietly against her hair, "Every song, every one." She understood what he meant because she always understood what he meant. They went home through the October dark with the stars enormous above the prairie, and the horses steady beneath them and the North Creek property waiting for them at the end of the road, with the house and the east windows and the porch and the sleep of grandchildren and the long, quiet future still ahead. They went home, and the music went with them.